The neutral station known as Harmony Point hung in the darkness between stars. A massive structure of gleaming metal and transparent viewing domes that had been built specifically for moments like this one. Ambassador Yuna Park had not slept more than 4 hours in any given night since the preparations began, and the dark circles beneath her eyes had become a permanent feature of her face. But she refused to slow down because there was simply too much work to be done. She stood in the central planning chamber, surrounded by holographic displays that showed every detail of the upcoming ceremony, from the seating arrangements to the lighting patterns to the precise moment when the vows would be exchanged. Cultural advisors from both the Velthari Dominion and the Kreth Collective clustered around her like anxious satellites, each one pointing out potential problems and voicing concerns that threatened to overwhelm her if she let them. The Velthari required that all lighting be precisely calibrated to avoid frequencies that cause discomfort to their crystalline structures. One advisor announced, "The Kreth will not consume any food that has not been prepared according to their chemical specifications." Another added, "Both species consider the color red to be associated with death and should not be used in any decorations." A third chimed in. Yuna absorbed each piece of information and filed it away in her mind, adjusting her plans on the fly and finding solutions to problems that would have paralyzed anyone else. She had learned long ago that peace was not built through grand gestures alone, but through countless small details that added up to something larger than their sum. A soft chime announced a visitor, and Yuna turned to find High Counselor Sevik standing in the doorway, their crystalline form flickering with colors that the translator struggled to identify. "May I speak with you privately, Ambassador?" Sevik asked. Yuna nodded and dismissed the advisors with a wave of her hand, watching as they filed out of the chamber with curious backward glances when the door sealed behind them. Sevik moved closer, and their voice dropped to frequencies that barely registered in human hearing range. "I must confess something to you," they said, and their crystalline structure dimmed in what Yuna recognized as distress. "I feel nothing for Commander Tharak." Yuna studied the alien before her and saw the fear that lurked beneath their composed exterior. "You expected to feel something?" she asked gently. Sevik's form pulsed with confused colors. "Is that not the purpose of a wedding?" They replied, "Your human ceremonies speak of love and devotion and connection. But I look upon Tharak, and I feel only the weight of obligation." Yuna was quiet for a moment as she gathered her thoughts, and then she spoke with the authority of someone who had learned hard truths through painful experience. "Many human marriages throughout history began exactly as yours will," she said. "Arranged for political purposes between strangers who felt nothing for each other." Sevik tilted their crystalline head in confusion. "And these marriages succeeded?" "Some did and some did not," Yuna admitted. "But the ones that succeeded shared something in common." She moved to stand directly before Sevik and looked up into their shifting crystalline face. "Love is not always the spark that starts a fire," she explained. "Sometimes it is the fire itself, growing slowly over time, fed by choice and commitment and the daily decision to build something together." Sevik considered her words for a long moment. "You are saying that love can be created rather than simply discovered?" "I am saying that love is a verb as much as a noun," Yuna replied. "It is something you do, not just something you feel." Sevik's crystalline form brightened slightly, and they inclined their head in what might have been gratitude before. Departing the chamber, Yuna allowed herself a single moment of stillness before returning to her work. 3 hours later, she received another unexpected visitor. Commander Tharak filled the doorway with their massive insectoid form, their compound eyes reflecting the holographic displays that surrounded Yuna like a constellation of concerns. "I wish to understand something," Tharak said without preamble. Yuna gestured for them to enter, and waited patiently for them to speak. Thorak moved into the chamber, and there, mandibles clicked in patterns that the translator rendered as uncertainty. Among my people, bonding is a biological function, they explained. It serves the hive and produces offspring and strengthens our collective. But it carries no emotional weight beyond instinct. They paused, and their massive head turned to study Yuna with an intensity that made her feel very small indeed. To bond with an outsider, especially a Velthari, feels like betrayal of everything I was bred to be. Yuna nodded slowly and chose her next words with care. And yet you agreed to participate in this wedding, she observed. I agreed, because my people stand on the edge of extinction, Tarak replied. But agreement and acceptance are not the same thing. They fell silent, and their compound eyes remained fixed upon her face. I have watched you work these past weeks, Tarak continued. I have seen you labor without rest, pushing your fragile body beyond its limits. And I do not understand why. Yuna felt the old grief stir in her chest, but she did not look away. Why do you try so hard for species that are not your own? Tharak asked. What drives you to sacrifice your health and your peace for peoples who have never shown you anything but indifference? The question hung in the air between them, and Yuna felt tears prickle at the corners of her eyes. Because someone has to believe that peace is possible, she said quietly. Even when it hurts. Tharak was silent for a long moment, and something shifted in the way they held their massive body. You lost someone, they said. And it was not a question. In the conflict between our peoples, Yuna nodded and did not trust herself to speak. And yet, you do not hate us? She drew a shaky breath and forced herself to meet those alien compound eyes. Hatred would be easier, she admitted. But hatred has never built anything worth having. And I refuse to let my grief become a weapon that kills even more innocent souls. Tarak studied her for what felt like an eternity. And then they did something that no Kreth had ever done in the presence of a human. They bowed their massive head in a gesture of respect. You are stronger than your small form suggests, they said. And I begin to understand why the galaxy speaks of humans with such wonder. They turned and departed without another word. Leaving Yuna alone with her memories and her determination, she wiped her eyes and returned to work. Because the wedding was only days away and there was still so much to do. But something had changed in that moment. Something she could not quite name hope, perhaps. Or something very close to it. She would bring peace to these peoples or die trying. And she would honor her husband's memory with every breath. She took until the ceremony was complete. That was the promise she had made to herself. And she intended to keep it no matter what the cost. The observation hall was repaired within hours because the Galactic Concorde had not survived for millennia without learning how to recover quickly from disaster. But something far more profound than broken walls had been transformed by the events of that day. Ambassador Yuna Park stood once again upon the central platform. Her exhausted body held upright by sheer determination and the knowledge that she had come too far to falter now. The delegates who had fled during the attack had returned, and they sat in their curved seats with expressions that ranged from wonder to disbelief to something that looked remarkably like hope. But it was the faces of Sevek and Tarak that captured her attention most completely. The Velthari High Counselor no longer flickered with colors of fear and uncertainty, and instead their crystalline form blazed with steady light that the translators identified as resolve and something deeper that defied easy categorization. Commander Tharak stood beside them with a stillness that no longer spoke of rigid discipline, and the chemical sensors detected pheromones that every Kreth in the hall recognized as genuine bonding markers despite the biological impossibility of such a response toward an outsider. The attempt on their lives had stripped away pretense and forced both beings to confront what they truly wanted and what they wanted, against all probability and expectation. Was to complete this ceremony, Yuna cleared her throat, and the hall fell silent instantly. "We gather to complete what was interrupted," she said, and her voice carried a new depth that came from having faced death and chosen to keep living. "We gather to witness the union of two souls who have proven their courage beyond any reasonable doubt." She turned to face Sevek directly. "High Counselor Sevek of the Velthari Dominion," she began. "You came to this ceremony with doubt in your heart and fear in your soul. You questioned whether peace was possible and whether this union could mean anything at all." Sevek's crystalline form shifted through colors that spoke of acknowledgement and humility. But when violence erupted and death seemed certain, Yuna continued, "You did not flee. You did not abandon the being beside you. You reached out to catch a falling human who had stood between you and destruction." She paused and let those words resonate through the hall. "Do you choose to bind yourself to Commander Thorak?" she asked. "Not because politics demand it, but because you have seen what can be built when fear gives way to hope." Sevek's voice rang through the hall with harmonics that needed no translation. "I choose this bond," they declared. "Not for the Velthari Dominion, but for myself. And for the future we might create together." Yuna turned to face Thorak. "Commander Thorak of the Kreth Collective," she said. "You came to this ceremony with the weight of biological imperative and cultural expectation pressing upon you. You believed that bonding with an outsider was impossible and that peace was merely another word for weakness." Thorak's mandibles clicked in patterns that conveyed acknowledgement. But when a human woman stood unarmed before assassins who would have killed everyone you had sworn to protect, Yuna continued, "You moved without hesitation. You risked your own life to save someone you had known for mere weeks, someone whose species you had been taught to dismiss as fragile and irrelevant." She met Thorak's compound gaze with unwavering eyes. "Do you choose to bind yourself to High Counselor Sevek?" she asked. "Not because duty requires it, but because you have discovered that true strength lies in connection rather than isolation." Thorak's response came in pheromones that flooded the hall with meaning. "I choose this bond," they declared, "because the small human showed me that courage comes in many forms, and the greatest courage of all is the choice to love." Yuna felt tears streaming down her face, but she made no move to wipe them away. She reached into her pocket and withdrew two small objects that gleamed in the carefully calibrated light. They were rings. Simple bands of metal that humans had used for thousands of years as symbols of commitment. But these had been crafted from materials precious to both Velthari and Kreth traditions. "In human ceremonies," she explained, "we exchange rings as tokens of our vows, physical reminders of the promises we make to one another." She placed one ring in Sevek's crystalline appendage and the other in Thorak's massive claw. "These rings are circles without beginning or end," she said. "Just as love should be, just as hope should be, just as peace should be." Sevek and Thorak turned to face each other, and something passed between them that transcended species and biology and everything the galaxy had believed to be possible. They exchanged rings with movements that held all the gravity of 3 centuries of conflict and all the promise of a future yet unwritten by the authority granted to me by the Galactic Concord, Yuna announced, and by the power of the hope that burns in every soul who dares to believe in something better. I pronounce you united." She paused and spoke the words that would echo across the galaxy for generations to come. "You are no longer enemies," she declared. "You are family, and may the stars themselves bear witness to what has been forged here today." The hall erupted into sounds that defied translation. Cheering and chiming and clicking that blended together into a symphony of relief and wonder and fragile optimism. Sevek and Thorak stood together on the platform, their forms so different, yet somehow fitting beside each other in a way that seemed almost natural. Una stepped back and allowed herself a moment to simply breathe. In the weeks that followed, the story of the wedding spread across every inhabited world in the galaxy, but it was not the ceremony itself that captured the imagination of billions. It was the story of the small human woman who had stood unarmed before death because she believed that peace was worth dying for species who had never understood. Humans began to grasp something essential about the soft creatures from the blue-green world. Human souls burned with a fire that could not be measured or quantified or explained by any scientific analysis. It was not their strength that made them remarkable, for they were among the weakest species in the galaxy. It was not their technology, for they had only recently achieved interstellar travel. It was their stubborn, irrational, magnificent capacity to love in the face of despair. Sevek and Tharok returned to their homeworlds as symbols of what had seemed impossible, and the peace treaties that had failed for 300 years were finally signed, because the populations of both civilizations demanded it. The war that had seemed inevitable never came. Una Park was offered honors and titles and positions of power throughout the Concord, but she declined them all. Instead, she traveled to a quiet memorial station orbiting a distant moon, a place where the names of those lost in the conflict between the Velthari and Kreth were inscribed in stone. That would last forever. She found her husband's name among thousands of others, and she placed a single flower from the wedding upon the memorial. I kept my promise. Minho, she whispered, I found a way to make your death mean something. She stood there for a long time as tears fell silently down her cheeks, and somewhere across the galaxy, beings of Crystal and Chiton looked up at the stars and felt something they had never felt before. They felt the burning power of the human soul, the flame that refused to be extinguished, the light that could not be dimmed by hatred or fear or death itself. It was not destruction. It was the choice to create light in the darkness. It was love, and it would change everything. The darkness lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. And when the emergency lights flickered to life, they revealed a nightmare that Ambassador Una Park had feared since the moment this ceremony was proposed. Armed figures poured through breaches in the observation hall walls, their bodies clad in armor that bore symbols from both the Velthari Dominion and the Kreth Collective, and their weapons hummed with energy that could tear through flesh, and Crystal and Chiton alike screams erupted from the assembled delegates as chaos consumed the hall. Beings trampled over each other in their desperation to escape while security forces scrambled to respond. But they had been caught off guard, and the attackers moved with the precision of fanatics who had accepted death as the price of their mission. The leader of the assault strode forward onto the central platform, a Velthari whose crystalline form had been deliberately scarred and darkened. And beside them walked a Kreth whose mandibles had been filed into razor points. They stopped mere meters from where Sevek and Thark stood, frozen with shock. This abomination ends now, the scarred Velthari declared, their voice booming through the hall with harmonics of pure hatred. The Purity Alliance will not allow our peoples to be corrupted by human weakness. The Kreth beside them clicked their sharpened mandibles. Peace is a disease that weakens the strong, they added, and we are the cure. Sevek's crystalline form had locked into defensive patterns, their body rigid with terror that rendered them unable to move or speak. Tharak's combat instinct surged through their body, but they had been stripped of weapons for the ceremony, their massive claws empty and useless against the energy rifles pointed at their chest. The Purity Alliance soldiers formed a ring around the platform, cutting off any hope of escape, while their leaders advanced with murder gleaming in their eyes. Step aside, human, the scarred Velthari commanded, their weapons swinging to aim at Una's chest. This does not concern your species. Yuna looked at the weapon pointed at her heart and felt fear coil in her stomach like a living thing. She thought of her husband and the way he had smiled at her on their wedding day, the warmth of his hands and the light in his eyes, and the future they had planned together. She thought of the moment she had received word of his death, the hollow emptiness that had consumed her for months afterward, the grief that had nearly drowned her in darkness. And she thought of the choice she had made to transform that grief into something meaningful. She stepped forward, placing herself directly between the assassins and the couple she had sworn to unite. "No," she said, and her voice was steady despite the trembling that shook her entire body. The scarred Velthari tilted their head in what might have been confusion. "You would die for beings not of your species?" they asked. "You would sacrifice yourself for enemies of your civilization?" "They are not my enemies," Yuna replied. "They are my hope." The Kreth assassin clicked their mandibles in harsh laughter. "Hope is a weakness that leads only to disappointment," they said. "Step aside or we will burn through you to reach our targets." Yuna did not move. She thought of her husband's face one last time and felt something ignite in her chest. Something that burned brighter than fear and hotter than grief. 5 years ago, I lost the person I loved most in this universe, she said. And her voice carried through the hall with a clarity that silenced even the screaming delegates. "He was killed in a border skirmish between your peoples. Caught in crossfire that should never have happened." She paused and let those words sink in. "I had every reason to hate the Velthari and the Kreth," she continued. "I had every justification to spend the rest of my life seeking revenge for what was taken from me." She looked directly into the eyes of the scarred Velthari, and then into the compound gaze of the Kreth assassin. "But hatred has never built anything worth having," she said. "Hatred only burns and destroys and leaves nothing but ashes in its wake." The assassin leaders exchanged glances, but their weapons did not waver. "Pretty words," the scarred Velthari sneered. "But words cannot stop energy bolts." "No," Yuna agreed. "But maybe they can remind you of something you have forgotten." She drew a deep breath and spoke with all the conviction her soul could hold. "You call yourselves the Purity Alliance, and you claim to fight for the strength of your peoples," she said. "But true strength is not found in hatred. True strength is found in the courage to reach across the void and take the hand of someone different." She gestured at the frozen forms of Sevik and Tarak behind her. These two agreed to stand here today, knowing they might be killed. She continued. They agreed to make themselves vulnerable before the entire galaxy, because they believed that peace was worth the risk. Her voice rose with passion that burned like fire. "That is courage," she declared. "That is strength, and no amount of violence will ever be stronger than the choice to love instead of hate." The hall had fallen, utterly silent, and even the panicked delegates had stopped to listen. Yuna's soul blazed with something that the Kreth chemical sensors identified as death defiance, and the Velthari light readers rendered as crystallized. Conviction humans had no word for it that captured its full meaning. Some called it simply love. The scarred Velthari's weapon wavered, and their crystalline form flickered, with colors that spoke of uncertainty, but the Kreth assassin beside them clicked their mandibles in fury and raised their weapon to fire. "Enough of this weakness," they snarled. Time seemed to slow as the weapon charged with deadly energy. Yuna did not close her eyes, and she did not flinch. She stood with her arms spread wide and her heart burning with a fire that would not be extinguished. A small, fragile human facing death without weapons or armor, and in that moment, something shifted in the hall. Tharak moved. Massive Kreth commander lunged forward with speed that should have been impossible for a being of their size, and their empty claws caught the assassin's weapon just as it discharged. The energy bolt tore through the ceiling instead of through Yuna's chest. and Thorax's mandibles closed around the assassin's throat before anyone could react. "You do not speak for the Kreth," Thorak rumbled, and their voice carried harmonics of rage and something else. Something that sounded almost like reverent security forces. Finally reached the platform, and the remaining assassins were quickly overwhelmed. The scarred Velthari leader was dragged away screaming about purity and weakness. But their words held no power in a room that had just witnessed something far stronger than hatred. Yuna's legs gave out beneath her, and she would have fallen if Sevik had not caught her in crystalline arms. "You were willing to die for us," Sevik whispered, their voice carrying harmonics of pure wonder. Yuna looked up into their shifting crystalline face and managed a weak smile. "I was willing to live for you," she corrected, "which is much harder." Tarek loomed over them both, and their compound eyes held something that no Kreth had ever felt for a human before. "The ceremony will continue," Tarek declared. And it was not a question. Yuna nodded and allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. The observation hall of Harmony Point had been transformed into something that no being in the galaxy had ever witnessed before. And Ambassador Yuna Park stood at the entrance, taking in the sight with wonder that brought tears to her exhausted eyes. Thousands of seats curved in gentle arcs around a central platform that seemed to float in the midst of stars themselves, the transparent floor revealing the endless depths of space beneath, while carefully calibrated lighting bathed everything in colors that honored both Velthari and Kreth traditions. Delegates from 47 different species filled those seats in a rainbow of forms and textures. Beings of crystal and chitin and flesh and energy, all gathered to witness what many believed to be impossible. The Velthari delegation gleamed on one side of the hall, their crystalline bodies catching the light and scattering it into patterns that spoke of ancient traditions and deep suspicion. And their faces remained carefully neutral despite the historic nature of this moment. The Kreth soldiers stood rigid on the opposite side, their massive forms casting shadows that stretched across the floor like dark promises, and their mandibles clicked in low frequencies that translated to nothing at all because some emotions transcend language. Security forces had thwarted 3 assassination attempts in the past week alone, and Yuna knew that many in this room expected disaster to strike. Before the ceremony reached its conclusion, she did not allow herself to dwell on that possibility. As she made her way toward the chamber, where High Counselor Sevik waited, the Velthari stood before a mirror that reflected nothing because their crystalline form scattered light rather than absorbing it. And they turned when Yuna entered with colors flickering rapidly across their body. "I cannot do this," Sevik said, and their voice carried harmonics of pure terror that the translator struggled to convey. Yuna moved closer and placed her small human hand upon the cool crystalline surface of Sevik's arm. "Tell me what you are feeling," she said gently. Sevik's form vibrated with frequencies that translated to chaos and confusion. "I am about to stand before the entire galaxy and bind myself to a being my people have considered enemies for 300 years, they said. "I am about to declare that I choose peace over everything I have been taught since the moment of my formation." They turned to face Yuna directly, and their crystalline eyes held something that looked remarkably like human fear. "What if I fail?" they whispered. "What if this changes nothing and war comes anyway?" Yuna squeezed their arm gently and spoke with quiet conviction. "Courage is not the absence of fear," she said. "Courage is walking forward anyway, even when every part of you screams to run." She paused and drew a deep breath. "I cannot promise that this ceremony will prevent war," she continued, "but I can promise that if you walk out there and speak your vows with honesty, You will have done something that no Valkyrie has ever done before. And if that is not enough, Yuna smiled sadly, then at least you will have tried. And sometimes trying is the most powerful thing anyone can do. Sevik was quiet for a long moment, their crystalline form slowly stabilizing into calmer patterns. You truly believe this? They observed with every fiber of my being. Yuna confirmed. She offered her arm in a gesture that humans had used for centuries when escorting someone to their wedding. And after a brief hesitation, Sevik accepted. They walked together toward the Great Hall. And Yuna felt the weight of history pressing down upon them with every step. The music that filled the observation hall was unlike anything the galaxy had ever heard. A blend of Valkyrie harmonics and Kreth percussion and human melody that somehow wove together into something hauntingly beautiful. Every eye turned toward them as they emerged from the side chamber. Thousands of alien gazes fixed upon the small human woman, guiding the crystalline Valkyrie toward destiny. Yuna felt Sevik trembling beside her, but she did not slow. Her pace at the far end of the hall, Commander Thorak waited. Upon the central platform, their massive insectoid form perfectly, still in a way that spoke of iron discipline and careful control. But those who knew the Kreth will notice something unprecedented. Thorak's combat pheromones had been completely suppressed for the first time in their recorded life, and in their place the chemical sensors detected something that the translators struggled to identify. The closest human word was hope. Yuna guided Sevik up the steps to the platform and released their arm gently before. Turning to face the assembled delegates, she looked out upon the sea of alien faces and saw fear and hope and doubt and wonder reflected back at her in 1,000 different forms. We gathered today to witness something new, she began, and her voice carried through the hall with a clarity that surprised even herself. For 3 centuries, the Valkyrie Dominion and the Kreth Collective have stood opposed, locked in a conflict that has claimed countless lives and brought both civilizations to the brink of annihilation. She paused and let the weight of those words settle upon the audience. Treaties have failed because neither side trusted the other to honor their word. And negotiations have collapsed because neither side was willing to take the first step toward vulnerability. She turned to look at Sevik and Thorak standing side by side. 2 beings who represented everything their peoples have been taught to hate. But today, we try something different. She continued. Today we ask 2 individuals to stand before the galaxy and declare that they choose connection over isolation, partnership over enmity, hope over fear. The silence in the hall was so complete that Yuna could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Marriage in human tradition is not merely a contract, she explained. It is a promise made knowing it might be broken, a trust offered without guarantee, a radical belief that 2 beings can build something greater together than either could alone. She looked directly at the assembled delegates and spoke with all the conviction her heart could hold. It is the most human thing I know, and today I offer it to you as a bridge between worlds. She turned back to Sevik and Thorak and saw something in their eyes that had not been there before. Not love, perhaps not yet, but the beginning of something that might one day grow into love if given the chance. Shall we begin? She asked softly. Sevik's crystalline form brightened with colors that needed no translation. Thorak's mandibles clicked in patterns that the chemical sensors rendered as a scent, and somewhere in the depths of space, watching through the transparent floor beneath their feet, the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath. Yuna smiled and opened her mouth to speak the words that would change history forever. But before she could utter a single syllable, the lights went out and the sound of explosions ripped through the observation hall. The great hall of the Galactic Concord had never been so silent. And Ambassador Yuna Park could feel the weight of 3 centuries of hatred pressing down upon every soul in the room. She stood at the central podium with her hands clasped behind her back, her dark eyes moving slowly across the gathered delegates. And she forced herself to breathe evenly, despite the tension that coiled in her chest like a living thing. To her left sat the Velthary Dominion delegation, beings of crystalline beauty whose bodies caught the light and scattered it into rainbows that danced across the polished floor. And their faces remained utterly still in that way that meant they were calculating every possible outcome of this meeting. To her right stood the Kreth Collective representatives, massive insectoid warriors whose chitinous armor gleamed like polished obsidian, and their mandibles clicked in low frequencies that the translator struggled to render into words. These two species had been locked in a cold war for 300 years, fighting over territory and resources and ancient grievances that had long since lost their original meaning. And now they stood on the brink of full-scale annihilation that would consume billions of lives. The Concord had tried everything to prevent this catastrophe, and they had sent diplomats and mediators and peacekeepers to negotiate. But nothing had worked because neither side would yield even a single inch of ground. That was why they had turned to humanity in desperation, because humans had gained a reputation for solving impossible problems through methods that no other species could understand or predict. Yuna cleared her throat and the Thaddear sound echoed through the silent hall like a thunderclap. I have studied your conflict for 6 months, she began, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her heart. And I have read every treaty proposal and every failed negotiation and every analysis of why peace has remained beyond your reach. The Velthary High Counselor Sevik shifted slightly, their crystalline form catching the light and throwing pale blue reflections across the floor. And they spoke in tones that chimed like distant bells. And what solution does humanity offer that we have not already considered and rejected? Commander Tharak of the Kreth clicked their mandibles in what the translator rendered as bitter amusement, their compound eyes fixed upon Yuna with an intensity that would have made lesser beings tremble. The small ones always believe they can succeed where greater powers have failed, Tharak said. The words alone cannot bridge the gulf between our peoples. Yuna nodded slowly and allowed herself a small smile that held no humor whatsoever. You are correct that words alone are not enough, she replied, which is why I am not proposing words. She touched a control on the podium and a holographic display flickered to life above her head, showing images that made every delegate in the room lean forward with confusion. I am proposing a wedding. The silence that followed was so complete that Yuna could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Sevik's crystalline form flickered through a dozen colors that the translator could not interpret, and their voice, when they spoke, carried harmonics of pure bewilderment. A wedding is a human bonding ritual, they said slowly, a ceremony that joins two individuals in partnership. That is correct. Yuna confirmed. Tharak's mandibles clicked rapidly in patterns that suggested extreme agitation. You propose that members of our species undergo this ritual together? They demanded that a Velthary and a Kreth stand before witnesses and declare themselves united. That is exactly what I propose, Yuna said. And she kept her voice calm, even as every alien in the room stared at her as though she had lost her mind. The murmurs that erupted from both delegations were deafening, a cacophony of clicking and chiming and rumbling that the translators struggled to process. And Yuna waited patiently for the noise to subside. High Counselor Sevik raised one crystalline appendage, and silence fell once more. Explain your reasoning. Ambassador Park, they said, their voice carrying the cold precision of pure logic. Because what you suggest makes no sense to us. Yuna took a deep breath and thought of all the wars that humans had ended through marriage, all the alliances that had been forged when two families chose to bind themselves together. And she chose her words carefully. Your peoples have negotiated through representatives for 3 centuries, she said. And every treaty has failed because neither side trusts the other to honor their word. She paused and let that truth sink in before continuing. But a wedding is not a treaty between governments, she explained. It is a bond between individuals, a declaration that transcends politics and policy, a commitment witnessed by all who attend. Darak shifted their massive form, and their voice carried something that might have been curiosity beneath the skepticism. And you believe this ritual would succeed where all other approaches have failed? I believe it would change the nature of the conflict, Yuna replied, because it is difficult to wage war against people who have become family. The Velthari and Kreth delegations exchanged glances across the hall, and Yuna could see calculations being made in crystalline minds and compound eyes alike. High Counselor Sevik spoke again, their voice softer now. Who would participate in this wedding? Yuna had prepared for this question, and she delivered her answer without hesitation. The participants should be individuals of high standing, she said. Leaders whose union would carry symbolic weight throughout both civilizations. She looked directly at Sevik and then at Tarak, and she watched understanding dawn in both of them. You suggest that we ourselves undergo this bonding, Sevik said, and their crystalline form pulsed with colors that the translator identified as shock and reluctance. Tarak's mandibles clicked sharply. I am a warrior, they said, bred for combat and command, not for ceremonies and symbols, which is precisely why your participation matters, Yuna replied, because peace cannot be built by those who have never known conflict. She stepped down from the podium and walked slowly toward the space between the two delegations, and every eye in the room followed her. I will personally oversee every aspect of the ceremony, she continued. I will adapt human wedding traditions to honor both of your cultures, and I will ensure that this union is witnessed by the entire galaxy. Sevik's crystalline form dimmed slightly. You ask us to trust in a ritual we do not understand. I ask you to try something new, Yuna corrected gently, because everything you understood has brought you to the edge of destruction. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, and Yuna could feel the weight of history pressing down upon this moment. Finally, Commander Tarak spoke, and their voice carried the weariness of someone who had spent their entire life preparing for a war they had never wanted. The Kreth Collective will consider this proposal. High Counselor Sevik inclined their crystalline head, as will the Velthari Dominion. Yuna nodded and allowed herself to feel a small spark of hope ignite in her chest, even as the memory of her husband's face flickered through her mind. He had died 5 years ago in a border skirmish between these very species, caught in crossfire that should never have happened. And she had every reason to hate the Velthari and the Kreth with every fiber of her being. Instead, she had chosen to forge peace from the ashes of her grief, because that was what he would have wanted. And because she refused to let his death be meaningless, she would bring these enemies together. If it was the last thing she ever did, and she would make them believe in something greater than war.